He couldn't remember how he got there. The rain hammering on the roof stirred him while he wriggled, unbalanced on the sunken spring mattress beneath him. His head throbbed, and his vision was blurred. The room was unfamiliar, decorated in a style from decades ago. He sat up, rubbing his aching head, and began his search for an explanation. Though there were no windows, he could hear that the rain had stopped suddenly, and what was left revealed an eerie silence that made his skin crawl. John, a 36-year-old contractor, was a stranger in the old, unwelcoming house. He was fully clothed, down to his well-laced steel-toed boots. Had he gone to work? Did he come home last night? Where was he? Where was anyone? Swinging his legs off the bed, his feet hit the wooden floorboards, which creaked as if they were in pain. He checked himself for any injuries or clues that might explain what happened, but he was perfectly fine, besides the dull, painful pulse in his head. He turned his eyes to his surroundings. Although there was furniture in the room, there were no pictures or portraits, no jewelry, no clothing, not even a fingerprint as far as he could tell. But there was a splintering wooden door with a cast-iron knob tempting him to cross the room and investigate. He pushed himself up to his feet and stretched a bit, limbering up for whatever may await him beyond its threshold. The seriousness of the situation wasn't lost on him. He had a wife and 2 children at home who must be worried sick. He heard of people going missing near the area where he was currently working construction. There was a lot of shady business going on out there. But he hoped this, whatever it is, turns out to be just a simple misunderstanding. What would anyone want with him, anyway? Even still, he scanned the small bedroom for something he could brandish as a weapon, but he couldn't find even a hairbrush to defend himself with. Everything seemed to be bolted down. He strode quietly over to the door and placed his calloused hands over the knob. It was cold and heavy. Great quality, in fact. He found himself captivated by the astonishing craftsmanship of this unsettling yet alluring home. He was held captive, indeed. Before turning the knob, John pressed his prickly, bearded face against the worn wood panel of the door. He could hear nothing. Less than nothing. It was as if the edge of the universe was just beyond the door. He turned the knob quietly and was shocked that it actually opened. He swung the door in towards him and cringed as it creaked loudly on its hinges. The sound echoed down the wallpapered hall. He waited a few moments holding his breath, listening intently for any signs of life, anything that might indicate someone could hear him. But there was no response to the noise. John was alone, and he was both terrified and relieved. He stuck his head out slowly into the hallway and looked in both directions, hoping to get some sort of understanding of the layout of the floor he was on. For a moment, he thought he was seeing double. There were doors lining the narrow floral-printed walls, impractically close to each other. They were all identical, and they were all shut tight. Should he shout into the hallway, he wondered. However he got here, it wasn't by force. Maybe someone brought him here for a good, logical, non-nefarious reason. But maybe not. He carefully slid out from the room he was in and let his foot fall softly, realizing the floorboards were like town criers. The electric light fixtures buzzed softly around him, struggling to illuminate the space in lieu of any natural light. Becoming more desperate for answers as the minutes wore on, he picked a direction and began to walk. Though the pain in his head dulled his focus, the distraction of the mystery house reprieved him. But as he walked, John noticed that the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions. He lost track of the room he started in, and the hallways seemed to shrink the further he traveled down them. Panic began to set in. His mouth dried up. He must have walked by 50 doors before he realized there would be no end to the hall. He chose a door at random and opened it, stepping into what he hoped would be an exit. It appeared to be a kitchen. The appliances were immaculately organized, and the room smelled clean and sterile, as if nothing had ever been cooked there. But still, something about it felt off. Just like the room he awoke in, there were no windows, only painted walls and vinyl flooring. He rushed to the cupboards quickly and threw open the cabinet doors, hoping to find food inside. But there was nothing, not even a morsel. He yanked open the drawers, finding them all empty. There was no food, no utensils, no plates, nothing. John continued exploring the home, but every room he entered was exactly the same. Nearly empty, strangely pristine, and devoid of any personal touches or effects. He paced the halls, realizing it was time to shout for help, and he would need to be prepared to contend with whoever answered the call. He lifts his head and fills his lungs with air to yell, but is stopped by a faint voice. It sounded familiar, but it was so resonant, he couldn't make out any words. He followed it, realizing it grew louder when he traveled in a certain direction. The voice somehow led him to a wooden staircase. He galloped down the creaking steps to the floor below, taking 2 or 3 steps at a time, hoping to find an exit or someone who could explain what was going on. He shouted as he landed at the bottom.
Hello? Is anyone in here?
But it fell on deaf ears, if any at all. John always considered himself to be level-headed, but in this moment, he felt absolutely defeated. He was a simple man with a great wife and 2 amazing boys, and he admits, now that they're so out of reach, he didn't spend enough time with them. He would do anything to see them again, to hear his son's rowdy laughter from their bedroom despite it being well past their bedtime, to smell the sweet perfume his wife always wears when she's dropping hints, just one more time. He found the lower floor was even more perplexing than the first, more hallways and more identical doors. He opened one door after another, each revealing rooms that were perfectly preserved, but lifeless. But at one point, he would arrive at the same room, over and over, even if he moved only in one direction. He eventually lost track of the staircase. Again he called out, but his voice echoed back to him, unanswered.
Hello? Is anyone in here?
Desperation set in as he tried every conceivable exit. Each attempt to leave the house only led him to another, less hospitable part of it. It was as if the house warped and dilapidated around him the more precious energy he fed it. Finally, he found what looked like a workshop. It was dimly lit, but he found a chain pull on an overhead light and yanked it. Once illuminated, he found the room to be full of construction and demolition equipment, something he was finally familiar with seeing. He spotted a sledgehammer leaning against the wall in the corner. It looked brand new, and it looked solid. He lifted it up by the oak handle and gave it a twist in his hands, finding it had a good weight to it. He readdressed the room with a new intention. If he couldn't walk out of the house, he would break through it. He wasn't going to die in this place. He was determined to see the sun again. Rotating his shoulder and loosening up his joints, he found a good grip on the sledgehammer's handle. He picked a spot on the wall opposite from the hallway and focused on it. Engaging every muscle in his body, he swings as hard as he can, letting out a visceral scream that echoed into the void of the house. It lodged deeply, right into the wall. So it can be broken, John relishes. He's caught in between the urge to laugh maniacally and to scream obscenities at the exposed studs, so he does a bit of both. But his victory celebration was short-lived. As he rips the sledgehammer head from the wall, it reveals bright red brick behind it. Another forceful blow to the brick revealed a solid steel wall underneath. Not even a dent could be made despite John's best exhausting efforts. The blood vacuums from his face as he huffs to catch his breath. His ever-shrinking world is slowly closing in on him. He feels mocked and tricked by the house itself. If the walls could talk, they would be laughing back at him now. Minutes eventually turned into hours, and John lost track of all time, but his will to escape sustained him. His initial panic has now given way to a dull resignation. Out of anger and frustration, he bashed in a few more walls with the sledgehammer. Within the more finely curated rooms, he shattered the worthless artifacts and light fixtures. He finally found a well-furnished guest room and collapsed onto the bed, exhausted. He hoped this was all a dream and would wake up back home, trapped in his glorious normal life. He had no idea what time it was, but all the same, sleep came quickly. And when he woke up, nothing had changed. The house remained a labyrinth of identical rooms and corridors. John was devastated. But he found something in his pocket that wasn't there the day before. It was a flat, polished rock. He smoothed it over with his thumb and found it gave him a soothing feeling. He flipped it over and saw something was carved into it. It read, "I miss you." It was written in a very familiar handwriting, his wife's handwriting. It reminded him of the notes she'd hide in his lunch bag that would cheer him up even on his roughest days on the job. But there had to be a way out of this. He owed it to himself and his family to push on until he drew his final breath, to surface from the depths of this mausoleum-like house. This wouldn't be his final resting place. He just had to outthink it. He had to outsmart it. In a moment of clarity, John decided to leave breadcrumbs, hoping to find a pattern in the symmetry. A beauty mark on the face of his silent, stoic captor. He tore strips of fabric from the sheets on the bed and tied them to doorknobs in the puzzling halls, hoping to trace his way to a source, the beginning or the end of all this. But as he worked his way down the hall, he found the markers disappearing or moving to different doors when he wasn't looking. It's hopeless, he thought. He looked down at the strips of floral-printed fabric in his hands. He did his best to avoid certain other ideas they were giving him for a different way out altogether. Suddenly, he began to weep. The sound of his own voice, after hours of silence, startled and distressed him even more. His nervous system was wrecked. He used the walls of his tormentor as support and slid down to the floor. He retrieved the stone from his pocket and smoothed over the scratched letters with his fingers.
I miss you too.
Its natural coldness somehow warmed him inside, almost curing this chronic headache of his. He wished she was there. She somehow always knew what to do. He laid his head in his hands and sobbed quietly and alone. Through the ragged inhales, he thought he heard something, a soft, rhythmic drumming. He scrambled excitedly to his feet and followed it through the maze of hallways. His heart was pounding and his heavy feet were racing. The sound led him to a door he hadn't noticed before. It was slightly larger and slightly ajar. The sliver that might have exposed the inner contents of the room was pitch black from the outside. But he could clearly hear the thumping, like a beacon beckoning him home. It sounded like someone pounding against something soft. It was like nothing he'd ever heard before. It sounded alive. He pushed open the door and eagerly stepped inside. The room was dark, and John was surprised to find a small, flickering candle on a table in the center of it. The thumping continued, but he couldn't figure out where it was coming from. He fumbled for a light switch on the wall, but couldn't find one. He swung his hands in the space above the candle for a chain pull hanging from the ceiling, but only felt air. Then something next to the candle caught his eye. It was a note, written on blood-red paper. It was almost too dark to read. With trembling hands, he picked it up and pulled it closer to his face. The words finally came into focus. It read, "John, welcome back." The note slipped out of his dry hands and back onto the table. He gulped and shouted into the darkened corners of the room.
Who's there? Let me out of here.
He backed up toward the door and almost tripped over his own boots. But the door suddenly slammed shut and the delicate candle flickered out, plunging the room into complete darkness. He yelped and fumbled for the door, but it was gone. There was nothing but a wall, and his sledgehammer was long abandoned on the other end of the seemingly infinite hallway. The thumping was now so loud he could feel it vibrating his body. Even in the dark, he knew the walls were closing in around him. This was the final mistake of his tragic, fruitless odyssey, he thought. He would die here in this room, abandoned, with a splitting headache, all alone in the dark, and he, nor his family would ever know why. The walls finally reached him, and he drew in a last breath, preparing for the crushing end. A sharp white light burst in his face. The pressure of the walls and the soreness in his feet vanished unexpectedly. If it weren't for the ever-tightening grip inside his head, he would have thought he was dead. But then, a sweet, breathy voice serenaded him through a passage in the luminous void. He felt his consciousness drift towards its origin, and a constant cooling breeze of peace calmed his nerves. His eyelids slowly parted, and shapes and objects familiar to John became clearer. It was now quieter, and a hand moved in from his left side and gently smoothed over his chest, careful not to disturb the wires and tubes connected to it. He couldn't see well, but a garbled voice rumbled softly in his eardrums. He could only make out a few sentences.
"John, can you hear me? You did a great job during surgery, but we had to put you in a medically induced coma due to the infection in your brain. But you're going to be just fine. Just take your time."
As he began to ingest and process what he was hearing, suddenly he could smell the sweet, intoxicating perfume he coveted so much, and then a soft hand applied gentle pressure onto his. She had been there, right beside him, all along. He was never alone. Through both of their suffering, their loneliness, and their fears, she had been his rock, guiding him home. His calls into the void were answered. He felt his chest bursting with emotion, but he was too weak to speak. The house was already just a memory to John. A half-forgotten dream. Her faithful voice penetrated once again, like the breeze through an open window.
We missed you, John. Welcome back.